Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Margaret Wiener, and I teach at the University of North Carolina and at Chapel Hill.
wonderful, a lovely place, a lovely part of the world. Now, Prof, is that a beautiful little tea set I can see sort of above behind your left shoulder?
Yes, it is, in fact.
Really nice. Is it from a special tea ceremony?
No, it's not. It was just something that appealed to me when I saw it.
I like it very much. Want to start with my standard query I pose to people, which is to inquire as to what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you. What's going on for the prof in Chapel Hill that people want to know?
Ugh, so many things. Unfortunately, too many things. Most immediately, my university is falling apart. Um, and the country is falling apart that I live in. But I think the thing that's most on my mind and is related to both of those in different ways is a kind of crisis that I actually have been reading a book that makes it hard for me to label it correctly, but usually would be considered environmental. And that's the damage to the web of life, the ongoing damage to the web of life, which is much bigger than climate change. And I'm very much on my mind because I was in a meeting last night. I've become involved in this locally in relation, it was sort of prompted by a creek that is very close to my house. And our town council that wants to turn what was a lovely little town into a city wants to pave the last remaining section next to this creek.
Of course it does. Of course it does.
Of course it does. So I actually got involved with this several years ago, and I've been involved in meetings and speaking. I teach more and more courses that are related to those issues. So that's basically very much on my mind.
Yeah, you bet. I want to get onto the second issue in a moment
Yes,
because it relates to your research. But
yes.
can I ask you about UNC, University of North Carolina, a great Research One university being in crisis? I didn't know that.
I think it's in crisis, and I think many of my colleagues would agree. Increasingly, our state legislature is taking control of the governance of the university without any oppos they're preventing opposition and they're doing things. For example, last year they decided over Christmas break, so nobody was around, that they would close all of the specialized area centers, the Asia Center, the Latin American Center. Um, and the justification was that they were very expensive, that the federal government had cut funding for research in places like that. And even though these centers actually generate funds, they don't lose money. Then they decided they'd consolidate them into some massive giant center. So that was very disturbing. There have been on our board of on the board that governs the final decision, which was always sort of a check for things like tenure and hires, has seen fit to intervene increasingly. They didn't give a position to a distinguished professor last year. They voted not to. Someone who the university wanted to hire had gone through all the stages. They said, no, we're not going to tenure that person. So that hire fell through, at least temporarily. So things of that kind are very disturbing. It's the general in America corporatization of the university has been bothering me, turning it from a center
Yes.
for thinking to something that is about making certain kinds of money for certain kinds of people. That includes a decision the university owns some property that is relates to my first concern. That they want to develop into all kinds of things, but again, destroying the natural world in the process. So, yes, many, many developments.
This is not good. I mean,
No.
and as I've noted in conversations with other folks, it's part of the rat cunning coordination between right-wing think tanks, apparatchiks of the Republican Party at the federal level, and right-wing state legislatures that we're seeing all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very sad. But that doesn't mean that there aren't local specificities, and you refer in particular to these decisions about
Yes.
trying to destroy area studies
Yes.
and trying to control hiring at a senior level.
Yes. Yes.
Not great news. Now, Prof, in other news,
Yes.
cup of tea's just arrived, and
Uh,
so soon will come my breakfast. I hope this doesn't disrupt or things or annoy you too much. It's
Not at all.
8 in the morning here, and I've just had my morning swim, and so I need the sustenance in order to continue. I hope that's okay, Prof.
That is fine.
As an anthropologist, you're used to food being at the absolute base of social organization. I think it's
It's
fair to
very
say
true.
cultural
It's very
meaning,
true.
right? And actually,
Yes.
that does relate to your opening remarks, which were very powerful, I thought, both again in their specificity, hola, ¿qué tal? With reference to the local arroyo, but also with reference to the destruction of the web of life and not just climate change. And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit on that, because this does relate very much to some of your perhaps more recent research.
Hmm. Yes, very, very, I think it was interesting. The creek made me, it was this bizarre switch that turned on that led me to realize as an anthropologist, I'd always heard the word development as relating to foreign policy, yes, and as affecting the places that I had done research in and loved, and this notion of there was a particular way of living in the world that was correct and that was superior and that needed to be adopted everywhere. And it wasn't just foreign policy, it was also national policies on the part of nation states such as Indonesia, anywhere that counted as decolonized, supposedly, or no longer independent nation states after the end of the Second World War, thereabouts. But I realized with the creek that no, this is the same development that goes on in my own country, in my own neighborhood, and it involves this particular notion that prioritizes a particular kind of economy, a particular kind of life for human beings, and doesn't really have any concerns about the fact that we are not separate from the rest of life on the planet, that we're dependent on it. And that began to really disturb me considerably. And I've
Mm.
gotten very interested in learning more about the rest of that web. I mean, even it strikes me as increasingly bizarre that I own land, that I live in a house, that the land here belongs to me as a human. I don't think it does belong to me as a human. I think I share it with all of the other living beings that occupy that territory. And I feel very passionate about those kinds of relationships.
Now, you've done a great deal of field work in Indonesia,
Yeah.
specifically Bali, I believe.
Yes.
Could you tell us what, looking back, you see from your experiences in the field in terms of rethinking this notion of ownership, land, development?
That's a really interesting question because, and it was sort of funny. I wrote a paper recently that began to make me think more about those issues. But certainly, I think my understanding is that in Bali, land is ultimately not the property of human beings. It is ultimately the property of other beings that are responsible for the welfare of that land, and that humans have relations with those other beings in order to maintain that. But on the other hand, Bali has been sold by by the government of Indonesia as a site of, well, it started under the Dutch as a site of tourism, and increasingly expats and other people living on that in that territory, and the preservation of those relationships is often it's very real, but it's often highly restricted. So the tourist is delighted by the young woman who comes by in the morning and makes offerings at a tiny little shrine in the hotel. But that is an expression of those relationships. And in the meantime, development has also disrupted those relationships by causing ecological damage to the island, water, and the degree of waste in its production. When I first went to Bali, a long time ago now, um, one of the things that in retrospect I really loved was at that time, a lot of the way people would eat would be on leaves. In my family, anyway, that I lived with, there'd be like banana leaves, and your food would be on that, and you'd eat it with your hands. And then increasingly over the years, as I went back, I saw the introduction of plastic, right? Plastic bags everywhere, and things that are not plastic. In my view, is one of the worst um, discoveries, inventions of the post-war era. Um, and increasingly people developing different ways of, since we're talking about food, of relating to food, of eating food, of and certainly the development of these industries and these new inhabitants of the island makes an enormous difference as well in the way people relate to the world around them. So that, I think, is what I would say about land in Bali.
Getting back to this issue of whether people really own things,
Yes.
I wonder if how that relates or doesn't to another concept that you've written about very powerfully, a concept often condemned and put in opposition to real knowledge. I'm talking
Hmm.
about the M word.
Yes.
Is there something related to magic in this other notion of ownership, of living together, of interdependency?
Well, as you know, I've recently, within the past year, published a book that was trying to interrogate the use of the word magic, which, of course, many of the people being drawn to places like Bali are attracted to it because they think it's magical, right? And some of that I completely understand and relate to, and can appreciate. But I also am disturbed by what that concept does in terms of thinking carefully about relations people have with each other and with the world around them. It tends to um, treat them all as somehow something, it relates, the word magic has a European history. And I find when it is used to speak about other people or other places, that history is imposed in some way. So magic makes something unreal, or its reality is somehow different from the real material world that we live in. And there's nothing immaterial about the relations people have with the world, um, everywhere, and all kinds of people and throughout time. It's not immaterial. This tension between what we think of as spirit and matter is such a European conception, not only European, but it's a very much a dichotomy that doesn't that misleads in when we think of something being spiritual, it's transcendent, it's other, it's about religion, it's about certain kinds of experiences that are affective, but it somehow becomes immaterial. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in the writing of that book is to challenge, who uses the word for what? That becomes my big question. What work does the word do? And often that work is to take the practices of people who are not European American or not elites within places like Indonesia and render them problematic or charming or sweet or attractive, but not something that is about what's really
What's
real.
really going on? And there's a wonderful provocation in your book's title, Prof. Because I live and work in the global south, we have very limited access to books written in English. But I love this subtitle. So the title, Magic's Translations, the subtitle, Reality Politics in
Yes,
Colonial Indonesia. And
yes,
here you're juxtaposing magic as part of reality politics.
yes,
You're also bringing your thinking to bear on the poor old Dutch.
yes.
The colonial burden is great, Prof, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and of course I ended up with the Dutch because I've worked in Indonesia, right? But then the more I explored it, the more I thought this is understood. People who write about colonialism almost invariably write about the British Empire or the French, right? Or maybe the Spanish for an earlier moment. And yet the Dutch were so crucial. Their empire became more minor over time, but they were so innovative in so many disturbing ways, um, and ways that are also very connected to these processes, right? As even the reputation of the Dutch as pragmatic, hard-headed, realistic people, or their art as real somehow, the Golden Age art. But as I write in the introduction to the book, the Dutch invented the stock market, for example. Maybe not the Dutch East India Company. A friend of mine says they're not the first corporation. They're the second, that the British East India Company was slightly before. But the Dutch did do the stock market. So I think that counts for a great deal. Um, and certainly were um, also, as I tried to show in the book, it's complicated because on the one hand, that reputation for being so hard-headed and realistic and juxtaposing themselves over time to these superstitious people that they were ruling over in their colony in the East, which was their major colony after a while. Um, they also were drawn in in interesting ways. So, in the book, I'm sort of really interested on the one hand, it sort of starts with colonial governance and the places where particular Indonesian practices end up getting translated into magic and as a problem for the government. And then as the book progresses, it's also, oh, wait, but it was also, there were also all of these stories that were circulating about Dutchmen bewitched by Javanese women, right? And or stories that circulated that ended up becoming a very famous novel about a mysterious event that occurred in the 1830s in the town of Sumedang, or even the object, the kris, right, which became this um, kind of I was really intrigued when Dutch curators at a conference I was at some years ago informed me that they're constantly having people come into the museum to meet with them because they've inherited a kris or they've purchased one on a visit to Indonesia, and they think it's causing them problems. And what should they do about it, right? So it's a very complicated set of relations that are moving back and forth. But it is about what is really real. So that's the reality politics, that the politics of colonialism are not only, they're certainly about extraction, they're certainly about all of the um, those kinds of material relations, but they're also about removing things from a context and then saying, see, these people, they don't really think in a reasonable way. We're, on the other hand, we're reasonable. We're rational, we're correct about what's true and what's not.
After 48, what becomes of the relationship between the Dutch and Indonesia? Do they
It's
matter still?
yes and no. I mean, one of the things that perhaps for Indonesian academics is unfortunate is that the Dutch were their colonizers because they didn't have the advantage that people in South Asia had of having English as their colonial language. And, people don't speak Dutch, for example, at this point. Very, very old people, when I was doing my research, might know Dutch. And the Dutch used Malay, which became Indonesian, as the language of rule. But there's a very interesting thing that's been happening in the past few years involving Dutch museums, which is the return of objects to Indonesia. And that's rather striking and intriguing. And I don't know enough about it. I know some because I was friends with a curator who was involved in that project. Um, but it's also complicated because the objects move back into, for example, the National Museum. And they didn't necessarily originate as a national property. They become property again, property of the state. So complicated relations.
Getting back to magic,
Yes.
which is also a major theme of your previous book, Visible and Invisible Realms, Power, Magic, and Colonial Conquest in Bali. Did you learn to do magic? Can you do
No, I no, because I'm not sure I know what magic is, but I
Prof,
certainly
Prof, we've written two books about it.
yes, but we haven't. I mean, this is the problem. The second book comes directly out of the first in the sense that when I wrote the first book, magic was not a problematic concept. And this, I was being told these amazing stories that I really felt obligated to share by people who'd been ignored, older people in particular, who'd been ignored these stories about, historical events. And to me, they were delightful and charming. And, as an anthropologist, I had inherited the concept of magic as as a part of my toolkit, but I also personally was attracted to fantasy, and, so it was very easy, and also the dictionaries led me this way um, to translate the key concept I was hearing, which was Kasaktian, as magical power. And as I write in the beginning of this book, that was fine for me until a colleague, an anthropological colleague who worked in Bali, said to me, "So I really liked the book, the first book, but why did you translate Kasaktian as magical power? Why not just power?" And I really was brought up short. And I started to think about that and my first reaction was, well, the dictionaries, that's one of the definitions. And then I was like, yes, but why is it one of the dictionary definitions? And what does that modifier do? And that's what led me to the second book. That was one of the things that led me, and also a dissatisfaction with the sense of the people I had spoken to and come to care about in Bali were brilliant. They weren't idiots. And magical made it sound like, hmm, again, they're not really reasonable or they believe in things. It was this notion of belief that we have this, even a song. Do you believe in magic? And I find that notion of belief troublesome. I like to tell students in my classes, do you believe in electricity? Right? You don't know how it works. You use it, but do you believe in it? It's a troublesome question, right? And in the same way, this is why I became really disturbed by the way people refer to things as magic, because it's a statement of, I don't know how it works. I think it's, I believe in something, but it's not necessarily true or real. So no, I learn to live as Balinese people live when I'm in Bali and even extend beyond it to a certain extent. I learned to adopt some practices. And I think that anybody who takes seriously their role as an anthropologist becomes a kind of has a kind of multiple position in the world. They're no longer fully of their own society, but they're certainly not of the new one either. But they're sort of in this complicated mix of things. So
Related to
I
that,
don't know.
Prof, anthropology has gone through its own
Yes,
self-excoriation over ties to colonialism, theft, but also things like the American war in Vietnam
yes,
and US support for authoritarian forces.
yes,
Listeners may not know that the Indonesian government killed 500,000 communists in
yep,
1965 with the blessing of you know who.
yes,
And of course, also with the blessing of you know who, invaded East Timor less than
yes.
a decade later. This is not to say anthropology is responsible for any of that, but it's clear that the CIA and the feds in general, the Pentagon, learned a lot from the area studies that they're now denouncing. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that self-critical gaze that anthropology has turned so powerfully on itself in the last few decades, because but certainly the last 50 years, there's immense
Yes.
self-criticism, isn't there? Could you reflect a bit on that and your experience coming through?
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting issue for me, as someone who was trained in a particular kind of anthropology, and then as someone who's been teaching anthropology for quite a long time now. I'm in favor of it. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a healthy sign when a discipline challenges itself and challenges its concepts and reinvents itself. I don't see that as a problem. I see it as important, and I think, this book is partly about that. It's about what I inherited as an anthropologist and what I'm therefore feeling, and not only conceptually inherited, but I'm thinking of inheritance also in terms of habits of thinking, habits of response, habits of affect, that aren't necessarily as easy to critique as concepts. When I was in Bali, it was the height of the Suharto era, and I was really ignorant. And I'm astounded in retrospect about how ignorant I was. I mean, it was interesting because it would come up in interesting ways at the edges of conversations, or there was one television station and it was the national station, and there was a lot of Suharto on that station, and the people I knew weren't necessarily fans, right? But it was also, they were very aware of danger. And many years later, I mean, I was in Bali in 1999 for the first real elections, and it was very exciting. And people were really, there were so many parties, and it was really a exciting period, Reformation. And yet, like most reformations or revolutions, things don't fully change, right? Um, as we're seeing now with the government of Indonesia has brought back people who were important in that period. But I became more and more aware of the 65 events. I heard things about them. They'd come up in these conversations in the 80s. But after Reformation, I thought, oh, people now will feel free to talk about things. And what I found is the people I had known who had been very affected, and I'd heard their stories about what had happened to them in the 60s. And I heard news stories when I asked that about people I didn't realize, like our next door neighbor whose husband had been killed and nobody had ever mentioned that, or another neighbor who, you know, I found out people who had been much more affected than people I knew who had been affected that nobody had talked about earlier. But I also had my best friend tell me, she didn't feel it was so good to talk about these things still. She felt it was dangerous. And and I understand, now that I'm living in an America that reminds me a lot of much more of that period of Indonesian history. I'm disturbed by the fact that I didn't know more when I went to the field, but I'm also disturbed by the assumption that, oh, that's far away and distance in time and space because it no longer feels at all distant.
And
And the United States' role seems to me really crucial.
part of this is to do with the fact that General Suharto, who led the coup in 65 and
Yes.
who was the dictator for decades, had a powerful oligarchy around him, some of it family
Yes.
members, some of it beyond family members, and that oligarchy was never disassembled. And you
Right.
see similar problems in the Philippines, for example, too,
Right.
where these oligarchies are sticky.
Yes.
They're very sticky. They're very fully formed. Here in Mexico, where we allegedly have a progressive government, it doesn't touch the oligarchs
Right.
at all,
Right.
at all.
Right. And that is, I think, a global problem. And those are, the people responsible for the destruction of the planetary web of life as
Take
well.
us back to that. Now, in terms of what you were and weren't
Yes.
prepared for back in the 80s, to me, this relates to one of the splits in area studies and specifically about Indonesia. On the one hand, we have Ben Anderson, who's essentially expelled from the country for decades and not welcome.
Mm-hmm.
On the other, we have Clifford Geertz, who
Mm-hmm.
is always welcome, it seems. Geertz, much more important in anthropology, Anderson, perhaps more important in Marxism. When you were learning anthropology or learning area studies, did you confront these very different interpretations of Indonesia? Or was Anderson not on the reading list?
Well, I didn't go to Cornell. Um, and that's important because Cornell anthropologists, many of the anthropologists who worked in Indonesia did go to Cornell. I was at the University of Chicago, which did not have an Indonesia specialization. There were some of us. So it wasn't an area study center for Indonesia.
Aha, got
It
it.
was
Got it.
different if you were in South Asia. Then it was a big center. So I didn't learn area studies exactly. I read, my advisor had worked in Indonesia and I read things about Indonesia, and I was critical of Gertz, but I wasn't necessarily exposed to Anderson initially, although I did, his idea of power piece definitely speaks to things I was writing about in my first book. But the tension in anthropology between political economy and culture, I went to a culture university. It was the culture university. It was not Clifford Geertz, but it was people like Marshall Solins who very much influenced me, although I think the more ironically formative influence over time was another member of my committee, Barney Cohn, who was studying really interesting things about colonialism in India. Um, and when I started teaching, I had these wonderful experiences for a while. I had a colleague here who's still one of my best friends, who had very much learned the political economy. And we started teaching together our graduate seminar for a couple of years. And we were delighted by where we were coming together, new ways we were coming together, that it wasn't necessarily a split. Certainly over time, I teach a lot of political economy. I know a lot of political economy. I'm not particularly fond of the concept of culture, but I'm not as you know from my research, I'm not someone who does political economic research in that way. I've become much more influenced by science studies, for example, which is a very different approach to both, right? To these kinds of questions. And it is very much the part of it that interested me is what counts as real? What is real? How do we make realities? So that became interesting. And certainly, Marx is speaking to that, but he's speaking to part of that, and not all of that. So, and culture speaks to, I don't like culture because it's separated off from the natural world. So that's part of the problem for me with the concept of culture. It's all about humans, right? Um, but that split doesn't seem to me as interesting, perhaps, as it once did.
Fair enough. And
Yeah.
on the web page of your department, pardon me, you speak of the influence of having done your undergrad major in philosophy.
Yes,
And I
yes.
wonder if you could reflect a bit on that. First of all, what kind of philosophy? Is it the entirely mystical and mad, faith-driven Anglo-American neoclassical economics notion of philosophy? Or is it the slightly less mad continental version? Or is it a mix?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, basically in American universities, what you get is Anglo-American analytical philosophy. But on the other hand, there was someone teaching Nietzsche at the time who I had actually read already that I found really intriguing. And I think it was mainly that I was interested in thinking about, and, what I got mainly from my undergraduate philosophy experience. And I had wonderful teachers in doing things like epistemology. So thinking about knowledge and what knowledge is. So that's the continuity I think that exists, not the Anglo-American particular approaches, but thinking about what counts as knowledge and that grounding in, epistemology. And then later, even in graduate school, I was sitting in on some more continental courses, but I think it was basically that grounding made me appreciate when I discovered through, for example, someone like Bruno Latour, who is not, he fits neither of those traditions in an easy way. But Isabel Stengers, who wrote the afterword to my book, who was one of his close colleagues, she's still alive, he's not, um, was very influenced by Deleuze and by Whitehead. And a lot of the people I find interesting now, who I find interesting to read, are influenced by Whitehead or Deleuze. So I don't know. I think it's my inclination is to sort of think about, I'm interested in concepts, but I don't want concepts that are floating the way philosophers do. I'm very grounded in the empirical, and I find that really important.
And so, of course, was Latour. You
Yes.
draw on his science ethnographies. Could you speak a little bit about the importance of Latour and Stengers for you?
Yes, I mean, Latour really was a turning point for me, other than my colleague asking me, why did you translate Kusaktian as magical power as opposed to just power? Not long after that, a colleague at the time, a brilliant colleague, invited Bruno Latour. He was coming to the area. He was going to give talks at Duke and UNC. He wasn't well known at the time. It was the mid 90s. And I met him and I heard his talks, and he was talking at that point about a concept he called the factiche. And he was interested in the making of facts, as that was the science part, but he was also interested in this image of the fetish. And in French, of course, the root of both of those words goes back to make, right? So, and he was interested in sort of iconoclasm and why people are always trying to destroy the fetishes. And I suddenly felt like, oh, there's something here for me that had made me unhappy when I finished my first book, with the way these particular objects, Chris, in fact, because people talked about those a lot in relation to power, the way they're talked about, this sort of and the way they're treated, which is iconoclastically once they move into a museum. So that's what brought me to Latour, and then I started reading, and I read We Have Never Been Modern, and I really found a lot of that spoke to me, but I kept reading him and teaching him, and my colleague that I taught with, Marisol de la Cadena, was the first to really bring Stengers into anthropology with her. She works on the Andes. And Latour had talked about Stengers, and I'd started reading her too. So it was sort of beginning to find in these sort of ways of helping me think through things that I wanted to think about. So I always start with stories. I think for me, the attraction, for me, stories are crucial in my work. They're kind of like the irritant in the pearl in the mollusk that to think about concepts. But I found these thinkers sort of helpful for moving me out of culture, for moving me out of the dichotomy between, let's say, culture and political economy into something else that seemed broader. about how the world is made, how worlds are made, how plural worlds are made,
And I guess
right?
it also leads to your breaking down the binarism of nature as opposed to culture.
Right, right, right. I don't see that that's helpful for thinking about either the things I think about, the research I've done or the research I want to do, or in the political dilemma in my town,
Yeah,
you know.
sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, ironically, and I'm relying here on the memory of an aged soul, around the time that the big man came to town and you heard him speak and
Yes.
read We've Never Been Modern, I think it was Goetz who tried to get him a membership of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and
Yes.
the analytic philosophers ganged
Right.
up and stopped this happening. I think they probably did the same with Derrida. And suddenly Latour became a person of interest to the New York Times. And I wonder to what extent some of his public reputation, which is huge in so much of the world, is owed to the fact that these nobodies tried to stop him becoming one of them.
You know, that's an interesting question. He's not important in American anthropology. I'm very unusual in finding him and in finding and the kinds of interlocutors that I find inspiring are not necessarily the key anthropological ones. But yes, I remember that whole thing with Gertz, and I don't think it was just analytical philosophers. There was the whole science wars around that time in the
Yes,
90s.
that's right. That's absolutely.
So the physicists at the Institute, or as some people call it, the Prinstitute, were very, opposed. They said he's opposed to reality. That
Yeah.
was a big thing. He
No,
doesn't believe in reality.
that's absolutely
Um,
true. I'd forgotten that part. Yeah.
yes, and the science wars were there was the whole thing with Alan Sokal and the hoax, and it was a very bizarre period of um, a misunderstanding of what the really rich interdisciplinary field of people studying science empirically, philosophically, historically were up to. It wasn't against science. It was like, how does this work exactly, right? What counts as, what makes something count? What makes it work? Um, and yes, but that had been a big issue. And also, like Marshall Solins tried to make, he brought Latour to the American Anthropological Association, but so many people really hated Latour in anthropology because they felt he challenged what they did. And so, I don't know. I'm kind of a weird thinker. What can I
What can you say?
say?
Now, in terms of La Cuenta, porfa, gracias. Your own position within the study of Indonesia, let's say.
Yes.
I'm assuming that what used to be called native informants are, in a sense, co-conspirators now. And there are probably some important Balinese theorists, analysts, and so on, right? That if you were now, gracias, sí, acabo de perder la cuenta, sí, gracias. That if you were now teaching a doctoral seminar, you would include in the reading list in ways that didn't happen when you were a student.
It's an interesting question. I've never really been able to teach Indonesia. Because the institutions that I've been part of, there isn't a market, shall we say. I mean, North Carolina is not a place that has a lot of Indonesians living in it. It's different when you're talking about, refugees from the American war, as Vietnam likes to put it, and I think it's a better name for what Americans call the war in Vietnam. Uh, North Carolina has enormous populations of, and there are heritage students from Vietnam, Cambodia, and when I teach a Southeast Asia course, I now teach just one. I've taught a couple of them at UNC. Um, what I actually teach, ironically, is about the legacies of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, and particularly interest. And this, the part that combines with my own research interests, is I'm really interested in ghosts, literal ghosts, right? And haunting. Um, and I that's what I focus on, but not just that. To sort of like try to discombobulate my students by teaching them about, look, there was this Cold War that America was very involved with that has lasting legacies in many places in the region. And at the same time, look, I'm discombobulating you because I'm taking seriously things like what we call ghosts and spirits. Right? So, that's what I teach when I teach about Southeast Asia. But I've never been able, there's never been a market, shall we say, for Indonesia alone. So there's a segment on Indonesia in that course. And I really like particularly the work of, um, my colleagues, Leslie Dwyer and her husband, Degung Santikarma, who is Balinese. They've written wonderful things on the impact of 65, for example, um, that do take seriously some of the things that I care about. But I don't know that my work gets read much in Indonesia. I tried very hard for a while to get my first book translated and kept hitting a brick wall. I didn't know how to do that. My press wasn't very helpful. I'd really love Indonesians to read my work, and every now and then I get a message from somebody like at Gajah Mada, we'd love a copy of your book. From the first book. That took forever. So it's very frustrating in a sense because I would love to be more in dialogue with colleagues in Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
And Prof, to finish things up, I've got one last question, and after you've answered it, I'd like to invite you to add anything you wish.
Okay,
That addition could take the form of traversing terrain we've already crossed, or it might be something entirely new that we haven't touched on. Does that sound okay as a means of drawing to a
sure.
close? So my last question, which is a bit like a promotion and tenure committee question, is not irrelevant to you, but nevertheless, is to ask what's on the docket now? What's next?
Well, that's a really interesting question. There are things that again are going to seem bizarre. Um, I mean, part of it, I've debated whether this current political interest locally could turn into something research-wise. I have a kind of tentative title, Conflicting Green Futures, but I'm actually the thing, I taught a great deal about, and this started again, it started in Bali. Bali was the first place I experienced dogs that weren't pets. And I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know what I was dealing with. And I gradually learned that most dogs in the world are not pets, and that most research on dogs starts from the assumption that it takes the notion of a species for granted. All dogs are alike. And isn't it, so I've taught this course for years called Canine Cultures, which is about the coming together of dogs and people in different ways over time and space. And I'm kind of that's one thing because I've taught it so much, and I'm really interested in breaking down this notion of the species that other than humans are all alike if they're members of a species. Again, it's about conditioned becoming, right? That other beings become as well as humans do. And I'm also really fascinated, although I don't know that this will happen. I became really interested. I made again, a trip in 2010 to China with my daughter, who was born in China. And I'm really interested in pandas as this very strange exception to the endangered species and the way the success that probably is unique to China, the adoption, the increasing interest in China. I mean, it is the charismatic mega species to end all. It's the mega, right? It is the one that everyone. It's this figure, and yet its existence is completely mediated by people. So I'm really interested in that and in the difference between what I saw in visiting at that point, one of the centers where pandas are bred, and what I see like at a zoo in the United States in the raising of the panda, right? Of the baby pandas. So I'm really, again, it's that becoming and not assuming that there's a unique essence to what makes an animal any more than I believe as an anthropology there's such a thing as human nature. right?
This means Marshall Salins did have a bit of an influence on you.
Yes, yes, I like certain things that he did very much.
And to finish, Prof, anything you'd like to add?
Um, I just think it's I'd really love to see more people thinking about humans as not just human, but in relations, right? To the rest of the world, the material world, including our built world, but also the world that the planet has built over millions of years, and taking that as a kind of priority. And I think the one thing I regret, I'm looking now, I'm old, towards retirement, and the one thing I'm trying to think about is how to continue educating people, because I feel like that's the value. I've been teaching a course where I've been trying to teach these things, and I feel like it's important to get people to think differently about their relationship to the rest of the world.
Well, I
So
can say you've certainly educated one person in this conversation. I'm sure that will multiply when people listen to it. Thank you so, so much.
thank you very much.